From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. Ask anybody who's recently tried to buy a home, and the frustration and disappointment is the real stress test. The real estate market has been red hot, with prices climbing at a record pace. It has raised alarms from experts about access, affordability, and whether younger people will ever be able to afford a home. Here's what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently said about it.
Young people aren't facing a housing problem. They're facing a housing crisis. We've got a generation of Canadians who are starting their lives and maybe hoping to start a family without the same opportunity as their parents or grandparents to get a first home and build equity and their future. Things need to change.
One of the things that recently changed is the mortgage stress test, which are part of the rules that define what banks are allowed to lend to people. A Star reporter, Jenna Moon, recently wrote an article that tested the stress test and what it could find her on a millennial's budget in this city. Spoiler alert, not very much. And then we will be joined by John Pasalis, president of Realosophy, a brokerage which takes a data-driven approach to the market. He's been outspoken about the need for changes so that young people might be able to own a home. But let's start with a bit of a first-person perspective. Jenna Moon is a general assignment reporter at The Star who also happens to be a young person who might want to own a home one day. She took a shot at what that might look like and joins us to discuss. Jenna, thanks so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So Jenna, you wrote this great piece, which I think crystallizes how tough it is for young people to get into the housing market now. But before we get to it, what do you really think about the possibilities of homeownership for yourself as an attainable goal in your lifetime?
Yeah, so I'll start out by saying that I've felt disenfranchised about the idea of home ownership as an option for me for some time. Housing prices have been increasing pretty steadily for years, and at no point have I really felt that I'd be actually able to afford a down payment. That said, I feel like homeownership is often touted as the goal for young people and new families as a way to invest in the future. It's one piece of what we're told growing up that, you get married, you have a couple of children, you buy a house to raise them in. It's like the trajectory that young people are told is their goal in life, a lot of people. And that's the way that we grew up and what we saw as normal. So on that basis, for a long time, I figured that eventually it would be my turn to do the same thing. But I haven't felt like this is an accessible option for several years. And the reality of it at this point is that the prices are so exorbitant compared to what our parents spend for the same kind of houses. We're working jobs that are paid about the same as our parents were paid in their generation. And at the same time, housing prices have skyrocketed. So stagnant wages in this area means that we have less buying power than our parents did, plain and simple. And we still fall into that middle class category with the same wages, but we don't have access to the things that middle class people were typically shown as having access to, such as buying, a family home. For the same prices that our parents were buying 3 or 4 bedroom homes for, we're looking at maybe being able to get into a 1-bedroom condo. It is not comparable at all to the houses that the generation before us bought.
Your piece was about being a millennial with a good income and what you could get. It basically was done to take a look at the new stress test. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the mortgage stress test, the goal on that is to make sure that borrowers don't get in over their head with the loans that they're taking out. And this is intended to prevent somebody from becoming house poor, which is the term that you'll hear for people that spent all of their income and are continuing to spend all of their income on affording a home. So right now, the stress test rate for a mortgage with a 20% down payment, either insured or uninsured, is the contract rate plus 2% or 5.25%, whichever of those is higher. Brokers at the same time are taking into consideration what your housing affordability limit is. And that is, 39% of your income for the mortgage and 44% or less for your debts. So when you take a look at all of this together, if you're looking at your monthly mortgage payment plus 5.25%, that bumps a lot of people out of that affordability limit. And that's what happened to me with this test, is that something that was considered affordable, once you apply the stress test onto it, it's no longer affordable for me. And that means that the mortgage keeps having to be reduced until it's at a limit that a lender would find acceptable for your income.
So you went and you called up a mortgage broker, taking your information. What could you get approved for?
So I sat down with a mortgage broker and I told her that I wanted to know if somebody like me could enter the real estate market. And what we found out is that despite my pretty good income, I was only able to be considered for $150,000. That's because the price of the mortgage payments exceeded my affordability rate. and my debt payments were teetering pretty close to that limit as well. At the same time, the amount that I can put down right now is fairly low. I'm already paying about 50% of my income towards rent. And that means that I have limited room to put more into savings. Obviously, bigger savings means bigger down payment. That could get me a bigger mortgage in the future. But it's clear that I'm going to have to save for a lot longer if I want a down payment that's actually reflective of the cost of housing in Toronto. There was a second version of this test where we assumed that I had $25,000 available to me for a down payment, and that would get me a $320,000 mortgage. It's still too low for a lot of Toronto, but it's enough that options actually begin to pop up within city limits. Obviously, though, as I said in my article, this is a scenario, but it's not a realistic scenario for me. I have a ways to go to be able to save up that kind of money. And I am working to increase my savings over time, but it's going slower than I'd like while I address, existing student loans, address my existing cost of housing and my, current debts that exist. So the $150,000 approval is basically what we're looking at if we want to be realistic about my financial situation right now. Basically, I went into this with no expectations about what was going to happen. And I want to be very clear about that here. I know I don't have good money for a down payment. I know that I'm in a situation where my savings is not where I want it to be. I know that I have existing debts that need to be dealt with. But what I wanted to see was if somebody like me in my position walked off the street and wanted to buy a family home. This is a single income person. This is a person with no children. This is somebody that would be considered firmly middle class. What do I qualify for right now? How hard is it to break into the market? And, what I found obviously is that I couldn't feasibly ask for a mortgage with this kind of money. I'm looking at places that are not livable. I'm looking at places much further away than where I want to be. And it's not to say that, I'm demanding that I live downtown Toronto in some perfect condo. This is just an ask for affordable housing that addresses my need to be close to work. Because one thing to keep in mind is that even if I moved out of Toronto in search of housing, what I would be looking at is a major commute to do a job that requires that I be here. I'm often, as a GA reporter, sent out to scenes to cover things that are happening, and I need to be able to get there fast. And for me, that means somewhere bikeable or somewhere that I can reach within transit because I do not have a car right now. So, pandemic remote working makes it easier to look outside of that range, but eventually that's going to end potentially. And for somebody like me, that means staying put.
One of the things in the article that just blew me away was, I didn't even know they were listed, is that, that initial $150,000 could get you a storage locker, a parking space. And I was amazed because the mortgage broker was, at the beginning, she thought you might be able to get a garage, but that was dreaming far too much, right?
Yeah, there is no garage.
Are those things listed? I'm sorry,
No, you know what? I did not find a garage listed anywhere. Basically, yeah, it's a parking space in a parking garage in somebody's condo that you can buy. And again, I'm not knocking people selling their parking spaces off. If I owned a place and I did not drive and I had this parking space, that's a pretty decent way to make a chunk of money back on the mortgage that you're already paying. That's smart. But it was that or it was storage lockers. And there was nothing that actually looked like a home. So what happens is that in this city, you get next to nothing. If you go into a listings website and you type in $150,000 max on them, it's actually absurd. The thousands of listings that show up when you first log on just disappear. And then you're left with 20 to 30 that are parking spaces or storage lockers. And when I started clicking through them, I found very hilariously, most of the listings were, parking spaces in a condo building. They were storage lockers. They fell into my price range, but they don't actually acknowledge some of my basic expectations for housing, which is walls and plumbing. Those don't exist. So I could afford them, I could buy them, but I would have a parking space to put my car if I had one. And that's not actually somewhere that I could sleep or should be sleeping.
Well, I mean, seriously, asking for walls. I'm kidding.
Well, and that really boils down to a question about affordable housing in general. I mean, we know that there are people living without those things already. It shouldn't be a difficult ask to have a home that is protective, that gives you shelter, that is somewhere that you can actually be living. So even with my good income, there were no options that actually addressed this need for suitable housing.
Jenna, what was the reaction to your story like?
So massive. I was shocked by the way that this blew up, I have to be honest. I had DMs coming in from people in my position that were telling me about how hard it is for them to get a mortgage, that they're being outbid on every place they put in an offer. And these are couples that have decent incomes that are in a much better position financially than me, that are being driven out of the market just because it's so hot right now that, it's next to impossible to actually win a bid. Like, that's the second step. If you can even get the mortgage to get a decent home, it's almost impossible to win it. And on the other side of that were people who thought that I simply wasn't trying hard enough, or that I just needed to make some simple changes and then I could just be, as well off as them and I could have a home. And you just have to accept that you're going to have to give up some luxuries in your life if you want to be able to afford this. And what I have to say to those people is, you're making a lot of assumptions, first of all, about the way that I spend my money. Second of all, I am in a position where I am already paying 50% just about of my income towards rent. That lowers the window that I have to save quite a lot. And it lowers the threshold that I have to save under quite a lot. And I'm sure all of those people will turn around and just say, live with your parents then. Like, do what I did, stay at home and continue making your money and, just share some expenses with them for a little while. And my parents are wonderful. Like, they would totally be okay with that if I turned around and said, I really want to buy a house right now. But I'm also 28 and I really appreciate having my own space. Like, I lived with mom and dad for a really long time and I don't really want to go back there at this present time. So I think people need to consider that there are lifestyles going on here that you need to be cognizant of. And it's not just like, I have a flashy lifestyle. I'm spending all of my money on like good takeout and clothes every day. I'm just existing here and I'm a single income. I'm one person living in a 1-bedroom condo. That makes my spending habits quite a lot different than somebody with a dual income, somebody that has family money coming in, somebody that, can stay home with mom and dad. It's a different situation for each person, but I'm not unique here, given the absolute just swell of emails and DMs that I got yesterday about this piece from people that really identified with, the situation that I found myself in.
Jenna, this is our last question. I want to know, what do you think needs to be done to help younger people buy homes?
Yeah, so I think, I'm not going to say that I have all of the answers here because I don't. But I think that we need to address this crisis head on. And it really is a crisis. Like, you can't tell me that if homes in your area are going for $1 million and there's people like me that can barely get approved for $150,000, that's not a crisis. I really think that the stress test is well-intentioned and it's a way to keep people from taking on more debt than they can afford. But we need to also somehow ensure that there is like a middle ground where properties exist that actually are affordable. Because right now, what's happening is people are being pushed out of the market rather than allowed a place that's actually affordable housing. And I think that, opening up supply designed as affordable is one way to make sure that there are options to enter the market in the first place. Toronto City Council last year approved a vacant home tax to come into effect in 2022. And that would open up supply and hopefully cool the market down enough for people to be able to consider buying. And I'm aware that the city plans to use some funding from the vacant home tax in order to be able to fund affordable housing projects right now. But what I want to see personally is somebody acknowledging that this is really happening. The market is difficult to navigate for young people unless they're already wealthy or they can tap into family money that could go towards a down payment. I just feel like it's important to say to people that you see them in the situation and that you're going to work towards at least laying out solutions for the problem at hand.
Jenna, I feel so bad for young people. I know how lucky I am to be in my home, and I know it's a function of timing as much as anything else. Thank you so much for sharing this story with us.
Thank you so much.
That was Jenna Moon, a general assignment reporter at The Star. We'll be right back. We will now be joined by John Passalis, who is a real estate agent and the president of Relosophy. He's been kind enough to share his knowledge with us before, so we are very grateful to have him back. John, thanks so much for being with us again.
Thanks for having me.
So John, I know you've been very vocal about how tough this market is for younger and first-time buyers, but one of the reasons we're doing this episode is because of the new stress test. What do you think about it, and is it going to have any effect at all, really?
I mean, it is going to have an effect. It's basically impacting people's maximum purchasing budget by about 5%. And, in a market that's as expensive as Toronto, Vancouver, a lot of these really expensive areas, that 5% is a lot of money. So I don't know if I support the policy. I mean, it came as a bit of a surprise. We already have a stress test. I don't know if we needed to increase it, but policymakers make their own decisions.
So John, we've seen a ton of stories of young people, couples looking for months for their first home now. We've heard Jenna's story earlier. I think one of the things that I want to do right now is trying to clear up a myth. And Jenna mentioned it as well when we first talked to her. And one of the things is that, some older people say, oh, you just have to try harder. Oh, you just have to look longer. You have to give up luxuries, no more cappuccinos, no more coffee out. John, you literally wrote a chapter of a report recently called The Year the Dream of Buying a Family Home Died. Can you please just explain how acute this problem is and what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, massive. I mean, the narrative you talk about is something I see online a lot on Twitter. I mean, and it's usually boomers and Gen Xers who are basically just saying, you're all complaining, it was hard when I bought a home, and so on and so forth, which is quite frankly, ridiculous. If you actually just look at the data, if you bought your home in the 90s or even the early 2000s, home prices were roughly maybe 5 times the median household income. So interest rates are a little bit higher, but it's at least possible to get into the market. Today, they're 10 times the median household income. And the challenge today is that if you're a young family, what made me write that sort of chapter is I got an email from a young family, their max budget is $700,000. They're basically making a household income in the low 100,000s, which puts them above the median. And they actually can't buy a home anywhere in the GTA. Unless you go to Clarington or, an hour and a half commute, there just aren't options. And I think this is the crisis we're in where young families can't even buy a house to raise their family in, and a lot of policymakers will turn around and say, well, stop complaining. You should learn to just become renters like they do in Paris, which again is just like such a ridiculous statement because we don't build family-sized rentals here. We build a lot of 500 square foot condo rentals, but you can't really raise a family in a 500 square foot condo. So, it's like we have policymakers who don't even understand the problems that they've created. And it's impossible to get into the market now unless you have a huge, huge down payment. And usually people are getting that from family.
Okay, John, what do you think are some of the things that can be done to actually help this particular type of buyer, that young person who's right now feeling priced out?
Yeah, so that's the challenge. When home prices are this high, it's hard to put in policies that make it affordable because it's not going to be affordable. Even if the government remove the stress test, allow people to take on more debt, that's not a solution to affordability. That's just allowing people to load up and take on more debt, right? So, at least from my perspective, any changes that happen have to be sort of long-term changes that move us to a more affordable market. Policies that increase the supply of single-family home construction, because that's not what we're building. If you look at what we're building more of every year, it's small rental condominiums. So we need to shift that trend to build more single-family homes. And over time, we need our policies to encourage, basically a market where homes are bought by people who are actually going to live in them rather than domestic and offshore investors, which is predominantly what's driving a lot of our market, especially your condominium markets today. So we shouldn't be filling our rental supply through single family condominiums or homes. We should be building purpose-built rentals, and the houses that we're building should be for people who are going to live in them. And these are long-term shifts that the government needs to prioritize as far as I'm concerned.
John, I think the Gordian knot here is that something must be done to help people buy, but somehow not affect people's property prices, right? Isn't this the thing that's just paralyzing the government from actually doing anything because they don't want to tick off a homeowner like me?
Well, partly, yes. No government ever wants to trigger a decline in prices. And I think Adam Vaughan, who's, the Liberal Party, had said they don't even want to see a 10% decline. People jumped all over him. And listen, there is some truth to that. If you're a policymaker, you don't want to trigger a decline in prices, right? But on the flip side, you don't want to go out of your way to artificially inflate them either, right? So, and that is one of the challenges right now, that the government, can't really or doesn't want to trigger decline. And then anything you do to make it easier for home buyers to buy homes just pushes home prices up further, right? In the short term, it helps, but it just makes things even less affordable if people can take on more debt. So we are in a tough spot. The best thing you can do in the short term is just not have prices go up 30% a year, which is what we've had over the past year. And getting rid of this rapid acceleration is probably the first thing we need to get rid of.
What is the advice that you're giving people right now? And also, what are you seeing out there? The weird thing to me right now is that, I'm hearing about some people saying, oh, I'm getting just under asking, and I'm worried. I'm just thinking that people have basically priced themselves so crazily right now. Like, it just seems like it's nuts out there. Like I said, what is the advice you would give to that first-time buyer? And yeah, what's it like out there right now?
So right now, it's actually a lot calmer than it was 3 months ago, which is crazy. Like the market can swing pretty rapidly. And right now on the ground, there's still a lot of activity, but homes aren't getting as many showings. They're not getting as many offers. So it's a less stressful time for buyers who want some options. But, the general advice I give buyers, the way I would approach this situation if I was buying a home is, if I could afford the home that I want in the neighborhood I live in, and I think when I say the home I want, willing to make some sacrifice. At the end of the day, no one can afford the home they want. Like even someone whose budget is $3 million is shocked at what they get for that price. So, as long as you can afford what you need for the long term, I would make sacrifices buying homes on busy streets. I would buy a relatively small home or whatever it is. I would probably buy if I tend to live in the home, if I want to live in the home for 10 years. I don't really care what's going on in the market in the short term. But if I can't buy where I want to live in the neighborhood or community that's important to me, and I can't afford the house in the size that I need for the long term, I quite frankly probably just wouldn't buy. Like for me, if the only thing I could afford is a house in Clarington, I wouldn't move there. It's nothing against Clarington. I just like urban living. I want to be close to the city. And I think it sucks if you want to have a family home, but at the end of the day, where you live is equally important. And at least for me, it is. And I couldn't, keep sort of the lifestyle I want living in an hour and a half outside of the city. It just wouldn't be consistent with that. So I probably would just rent in the city if I couldn't afford to buy.
What happens, though, with this generation if they don't buy and it becomes a generation of renters in this city?
You're right. It's a tough question. And it's hard because it depends on, where the market goes. In theory, our belief is that prices will just keep going to the moon. Historically, they don't. At some place, they might correct. They corrected in 2017. In 2017, we had a housing bubble and prices fell 20%. Right. And I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen one day that prices are going to fall. Like they can't just keep going at a rapid pace like this forever. And, the challenge, though, with that is that I always find it's like when the buyers see prices falling, no one wants to jump in because there's this fear that they'll just go lower. Right. And then what happens is they start to pick up and accelerate and the buyers are still on the sidelines thinking, well, maybe they'll fall again. And it's tough to buy in a falling market. You need to have kind of nerves of steel to be buying because when prices are falling, everyone's panicked, right? So listen, I think, as a buyer, you stay on the sidelines, you save your money and you buy when the timing's right for you. Maybe that is in the future in 2 years if prices end up falling a little bit.
We all heard about people leaving the city, moving out. The domino effect of that is obviously you're raising the prices in those communities out there. Reopening, urban life is returning. Are we seeing any of the return back yet, or is it too soon to ask?
No, we haven't quite seen that yet. I think because a lot of people have made a permanent shift. Once you buy a house in cottage country or wherever it is, you're buckling down there for a while. So we haven't seen that. I'll say where we have seen a shift back is in condominium rentals. So again, that was a segment of the market that got hammered last year with a lot of vacancies as people moved out of condominiums. But that market has quickly recovered downtown. And part of the recovery is because rents fell quite a bit. So we are in many ways starting to see early signs of that recovery in the condominium market, but we're not seeing sort of this mass return out of the suburbs. I think that'll take kind of some time for people to readjust.
John, I know this is a huge problem. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know about, these people who are facing this sort of seemingly insurmountable thing of owning a home?
It's hard because it's really, if you were born in a certain generation, I call this kind of like the birth year lottery where if you were born in the late 70s, kind of my years or early 80s, you bought a home just purely at a chance that you got in a time where they're pretty affordable. And, if you were born 15 years later, you're faced with this market that's almost impossible to get into. And all I can say is I think for a lot of people who are facing with that, you can't really, it's not great, especially if you want a home. I think you just have to make decisions that both suit your finances and your lifestyle and not worry about it because you're fighting forces that are bigger than us. You're fighting the Bank of Canada who's stimulating the market. You're fighting the federal government who's trying to stimulate the market. And, you be patient and one day maybe the timing's right and the market adjusts and it's the right time to get in. But, try not to worry about it in the short term.
That's good advice, John. Really, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
John Pasalis is the president of Relosophy.
That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajan Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.